All right, so in this video, I'm going to show the approach I take for creating transition animations inside of Maya. So if you're working in the game industry, you are probably going to be creating a lot of different types of transition animations. Not every animation that you create is going to be, the really awesome, like flashy combat combo attack animations. You're gonna have to be creating a lot of the animation set for a character or creature, and a lot of that comes down to maybe not the most flashy type of animations, but definitely very necessary animations. And a lot of those are the transition animations. So going from a walk cycle into an idle animation, going from the idle animation into maybe a run or a walk cycle, and then going maybe from the idle animation into like the walk, but turning 45 degrees as you go into it, or going from the idle and turning 90 degrees as you go into the walk animation. A lot of the times game engines can blend between, two different animations, but really you would want to author those animations yourself as the animator to make sure you're getting the best results. So as you're, creating the transition animation from a run cycle into an idle animation, you're able to go in there and create all the proper, breakdowns, get that movement feeling correct and getting the weight to feel correct as the character comes to a stop. All the things that just simply using a blend in a game engine is not necessarily going to create it and have it look as good as you would be able to create it if you were animating it yourself. So depending on, the creature or the character you're animating and really how complex that animation and that character needs to be, a lot of the times you will have to create a lot of different transition types of animation. So I just want to show the process that I take for creating all of those transition animations. And I utilize Maya's animation layers to make that process just a bit easier. So in this case, I've got this guy here and he's standing in just this quick idle animation that I created right at the center of the grid. And for this example, I'm going to use the walk cycle. So I'm going to transition from the walk cycle into this idle animation. And I want to use animation layers to get me part of the way there and use some of the blending that Maya can give me to just make this process a little bit easier. So I've actually got two Maya scenes open up here. So I've got this idle animation, and then I'm going to open up the other Maya scene. And this is my walk cycle animation. So basically what I have here is I have this walk moving basically just forward in space. And you can see I've still got my master control at the center of the grid. So I actually have this walk translating forward in 3D space. And you can see that it starts behind the center of the grid a little bit. So it's starting back here and it's walking forward. And then if I go to my idle scene, you can see I have my idle right at the center of the grid. And we're actually going to use one of Animbot's tools to do this. It just really speeds up the process, makes it really simple. So basically what I want to do is I want to bring in the walk cycle into this scene. So I'm going to select all of my control curves. And actually before I do this, I quickly want to mention one really important aspect of this workflow that I use. You want to make sure that things like your space switches are the same across your scenes and across, the animation that you're blending into. It can pop up some weird issues if maybe your arms are in world space in one scene and then maybe your arms are in local space in the other scene. If you're blending between those animations, you might see some weird like rotation issues and flipping as it blends. So I usually do a quick pass, make sure like if I select my idle scene, the right and left arms are set to local world at a value of 1. And then in my walk cycle scene, I've got my local world value set to 1 as well. So it looks like the arms are at a value of 1, they would be in world space. So you can see they're not following 1-to-1 with the chest. So the arms are correct. And then in my walk cycle scene, I'll select the head real quick, make sure the local world, what value is that set at? It's set at 1, which means it's in world space. So if I move my chest, the head is going to stay looking forward. Same for my idle scene. So in this scene, I can select the head control set to 1. So these are both matching. So that's going to be good as well. Lastly, I'll probably check things like the pole vectors for the legs. So these are set to a value of 10 on the follow, which means they're following the foot's movement. So you can see the knees are going to follow that. And then I can jump to my walk cycle scene and just double check. And you can see the pole vector is following the leg, set to a value of 10. Same on this left foot. All right, so that's working fine. Now we can actually bring this animation into our idle scene. So what I want to do is go to my selection set. I'm going to hit all to select all the control curves. And I'm just going to hit this copy animation button. So it's going to copy all the animation. And then I can go into my idle pose scene. And I'm actually just going to go ahead and add some negative frames in here. So I basically still want the animation to go into its idle pose where it's at frame 0. And I can always adjust my frames later on if I eventually want the entire animation to start at 0. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and just type in like a value of -30 or so, just to give myself some negative frames in there to work with. And I'm actually going to jump back to my walk cycle scene. And did I just add a keyframe when I rotated that? Let me undo that. Yeah, there we go. Make sure I'm going back to where it was. So it looks like the leg is at this position here. That should be fine. I'm going to go ahead and go back to my idle pose. So -30 should be okay. I'm going to go ahead and select everything again. And I want to go to my animation layers, and I'm going to go to layers. Oops, let me undo that. I want to go to layers and select it, and then choose create override layer from selected. So go ahead and add a new override layer. And an override layer will allow me to basically just add this animation onto this layer. And it's not going to try to blend the idle pose with it. It's just going to allow me to create this layer that's going to override any layer beneath it. And that way I can just add this walk cycle animation. So I'm going to go to Animbot here and go to paste insert. And that's going to drop this walk cycle in there. And you can see my walk cycle is going to go past the center of the grid, and that's fine because really I'm just worried about getting the first few steps in this animation. And then I'll usually just add in extra steps just in case if I need them. But really once I actually start blending between this, that's really the most important thing that I want to make sure that I get in there is getting those first few walks. And let me actually undo this because I think I copied that animation before I fixed the popping on the leg. So I'm going to go back into my walk cycle scene and make sure everything is properly set up here. All right, now I'm going to copy this animation again. Go back to my idle pose scene, go to layers, create override layer from selected. Go ahead and paste. All right, so that's working. There's some weird issues with the stretching. I guess when I pasted this in, it's not grabbing this. There's like some weird knee stretching. That's not happening in my walk cycle, but that's something I would fix. I'm not going to worry about it right now. This is going to be a relatively quick video. So what I want to do with this override layer, so now you can see that I've added the override layer. It's only playing the idle animation. If I hide the override layer, it'll show where my idle pose is, or excuse me, it's showing the walk cycle animation. And then when I hide it, it's showing where the idle pose is. So I can go ahead and turn that back on. So now what I want to do is basically blend from my override layer into my idle pose. So I need to adjust this weight value. So at a value of 1, it's just going to completely play my override layer. At a value of 0, it's going to play the layer underneath it, which is my base layer and my idle pose. So what I want to do is go to frame 30. And with my override layer selected, we can go ahead and name this. I'm usually really bad at naming my layers, but I'll just name this walk. And we can go ahead and hit this key button on the override layer there to lock a keyframe down at a value of 1 where the animation is turned on. Then I'm just going to go to frame 0 where I know my idle pose is, and I'm going to set this to a value of 0 on the weight and key that. So this is going to give me some really rough blending. And you can see we're starting to get there, but the blending that it gives us is not necessarily the best because you can see it's, speeding up really quickly and it's not really transitioning in the best way. And so once I get this just override layer in there, it at least gets that animation within my scene and allows me to start messing around with this blending option to get a better result. And this usually means I need to open up my graph editor to make some adjustments to the weight and how it's blending. So what I'm going to do is open up my graph editor here, and I'll kind of just bring it off to the side. Just something like that so I can still kind of see my scene in here. All right, and I'm just gonna select one control. Doesn't really matter which one I select. And I wanna come to this weight value. So this is going to allow me to actually adjust the tangent handle of the blending weight. So you can see I'm going from frame 30 to frame 0, and I'm just blending this walk cycle out into the idle animation. What I want to do though is I don't necessarily want this idle, or this walk cycle I mean, to start blending out as soon as it starts the animation. I probably want to play the walk cycle just for a few frames, get that animation in there, and then start transitioning into the idle animation on the second step. So I'll grab this weight value and I'll actually shift it over, maybe to start at 25. So you can see it's playing the walk cycle now, and then it's starting to blend out into the idle animation. And the other thing I want to tweak is the tangent handle. And a lot of this weight adjustment is kind of just trial and error, trying things and seeing how it blends. So I'm going to grab something like that with the tangent handle, and that's going to have it actually speed up really quickly and then slow down, which again is not really what I want. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to grab this tangent handle and do something like this and see how this looks. All right, so that's actually looking a bit better with the blending that it's creating. So it's still going a little bit too quick. So now what I actually might do is I might actually go ahead and grab this weight value and just bring it forward quite a few frames, because I need this blending to be a little bit slower. It's happening too quickly, and you can see we're getting this weird like speed up action. It's sort of like walking forward really quickly to get to the idle pose, which means we probably just need to start tweaking the weight keyframe here and just, again, messing around with this value, tweaking it until we get something that we feel like works pretty decent. And because we have the extra walk cycle going on here past frame 0, so if I go ahead and real quickly change this value to 1 again, you can see the character is still just walking forward through 3D space. So the walk cycle is continuing past the idle pose, which gives me a little bit more room to work with and allow me to blend a little bit better. So I'm going to actually bring this out to maybe 15. This might be too much. And what that's actually going to do is it's trying to blend with, the walk cycle that's happening underneath and the idle pose. So at first this looks a little bit strange because you can see it's going forward and then moving backward. But this is actually giving me a basis for a really nice overshoot settle as the character is coming to a stop. So it's walking forward, slowing down, stepping here. The chest is continuing to move forward, and then it's starting to blend backward. Now, obviously, this is happening too quickly. It just shoots backward, but this gives us kind of a starting point that then we can actually start adjusting the timing for this and start creating something that looks a little bit better. But I'll go ahead and play this here and see how this is looking. All right, so we've got some decent movement here. It's not quite the best. Let me actually see what happens if I grab this keyframe and maybe shift it back a couple frames. Maybe reduce that handle as well. I think that's working a little bit better. All right, so now what I want to experiment with is I'm going to take my walk override layer. All right, and I'm going to select everything. And actually, before I do that, let me take a look at my weight value. So I've got it starting at 28 and ending at 15. And in the graph editor, I'm going to select everything. And what you could play around with is maybe just bringing the whole walk cycle back and having it actually start a little bit earlier. So maybe it only takes like one step going in there. And this is something that I'll often play around with as well. Something like that. I think that might feel a little bit better. All right, that's not too bad. And we could even maybe shift this back a little bit. Let's see, something like that. And that way it's still starting on a contact, so it'll blend nicely there and something like this. So this is something I'll usually do as well. As I start messing with the blending, I give myself just a really long walk cycle to work with. That way I can start shifting those keyframes around and just mess around with the blending. I probably didn't need all the steps at the beginning to actually step into the idle animation. Usually with transition animations as well, you usually only want to take, 1 or 2 steps maybe to blend actually into the stopping idle animation. So usually just something like this can be good. So right now I'm just starting in a contact position and just going right into that idle step. So this should give me enough to work with. I might shift the animation forward by 1 frame, and I'm starting to kind of blend out. So just real quickly, I'll kind of show the process that I would take to start, refining this, adding a bit more detail to this stop animation. But this override layer allows me to blend between the two animations, and you can see we're getting a nice kind of stepping motion. So the legs are already starting to try to blend into the idle pose, so we're already getting a lot of animation for free. So I'm gonna go ahead and close this. All right. And I'm going to grab my base layer, shift select my walk layer, right click and choose merge layers, and I can open up the option box. I'll do a smart bake, and I'm just gonna merge this down. And you don't necessarily need to merge it. I just like to, keep things clean here, and I'm gonna kind of just start fresh and say, all right, now this is my actual animation that's happening. I don't have any layers in here. And the first thing that I would do is start refining the foot placement. So you can see it's trying to blend between that next pose. So I'm gonna probably find an area where I can see if I can stop this movement. Something like that. So obviously that's going to start to break some things, but that's all right. We can start to experiment with, foot placement and just trying to kind of blend between these poses here a bit better. And as it's stepping forward through here, obviously it's stepping into the idle pose. So we'll need to go further than what we might have done in the actual walk animation. So actually we'll need, to start adding more heel roll to this, so it doesn't completely hyperextend the leg, but something like that might work. And then it steps into the idle position like that. And then something else I would probably start tweaking is this motion here. It's popping back way too quickly. So I'll go to frame 0 and let me make sure I select everything here. And I'm just gonna grab all those keyframes and start shifting them back. We're getting some weird popping. Let me open up the graph editor. Looks like it's just going to be the tangent handles. I want to make sure everything's set to auto tangent as well. Actually, no, I don't want to do that on the whole thing because that will probably mess up the walk cycle. I just want to do it this end section right there. So we can start tweaking the timing as well, adding definitely more time to the stop and the settle backwards. So maybe even here, I will grab all these keyframes, shift them forward a couple frames. Maybe even here, this section, I think 8 to 6. Add a frame to that and just start finessing the timing. Something like that. All right, this foot plant is working okay. This one I need to fix where it steps, so I'm going to use the AnimBot to basically copy the pose after and just snap it into position there. Looks like it's rotated up. So I'm just gonna grab the translate X value here. I'm gonna copy that, paste it on 13. Same for the Z on 12, I'll paste it here. And stepping directly into idle. And you could really even add more detail to this if you are able to do a longer transition animation for a stop like this. Oftentimes you'll probably want it to be pretty quick to go directly into an idle animation or your idle pose, especially if this were like a player character, you'd want them to stop pretty quickly. However, if this was for maybe like an AI character that you were fighting or a creature, you might get afforded a bit more time to add more detail into a stop animation. So maybe as it's stopping, maybe this foot, lands out here a bit further on that plant. And then in the settle back to idle, maybe it, plants a little bit further, and then maybe it picks up the foot and, steps back a little bit into the idle position. So you can, add more detail like that into the stop as well. I'll go ahead and undo that. And again, for this, it's not gonna be a super long video. Probably won't show the entire process of cleaning up this entire animation, but kind of just showing the workflow that I would use to do something like this and kind of the techniques I use. So again, this is feeling all right. This still feels a little bit just fast in this section. So I'm just gonna start grabbing all these keyframes and just adding a frame here and there to just start increasing the time for this stop animation. All right, and I'm gonna probably grab this and shift it over as it settles back into that idle position. Just adding a bit more frames to this. And then this step here, I might bring up the height so it's not going through the floor. And then I'm just gonna have it plant directly into idle position. So I'm gonna copy that pose there, do something like that. All right, so I've got just the rough foot placement working all right. Then the next step would be, I'd probably just start adding a lot of different animation layers in here to add a bit more detail. So I'm just gonna grab the root control, add a layer, and then start refining some of this. So as this character steps over here, I think that's working. But then through here, all the weight is on this foot. So I need to shift the hips over that supporting foot a bit more. Maybe get a bit of rotation like that. So it starts to plant. Then through here, up through like frame 9, I'll just go ahead and hit this button, and this will sort of just zero this layer out to just basically use the pose that's underneath it. Basically kind of turning off this layer. So if I didn't add this keyframe here, obviously it's going to keep the change of translation that I created here, but then going to frame 9 and hitting this button will kind of zero that back out to where it would be. So kind of just stepping into position there. So that's working okay. Again, not the best, but I'd probably spend a lot more time kind of tweaking this. And something else that I would probably do is start adding a bit more forward backward rotation. And you can just do this all in the same layer. Sometimes I like just adding a lot of layers in there because it obviously simplifies my keyframes and what I'm looking at. So these are the keyframes for the left right movement on the hips. I might just add another layer, so I'm kind of just starting with 0 keyframes again, and then I can start tweaking the forward back rotation. So maybe through here at like -14, maybe he's leaned back a little bit as he's kind of coming to a stop. And I can play around with that there. And then as he stops, I'm going to hit this 0 button again, but then I'm going to bring him forward a bit. And this might be a little bit too much, but then he settles. I'll go to like 15 and 0 that back out. So it kind of settles there. And then maybe I'll go to like 27 and just maybe rotate him forward just a little bit. I might not need that. That might actually be too much. Actually, what I'll try is I'll hit the 0 button at 27, go to 15, and rather than this being the idle pose, I'll just go back a little bit. So it rotates back and then settles forward toward the end of the animation, back to the idle pose. So something like that. So you can see we're getting a nice kind of settle stop there. This rotation back might be a little bit too much. I might start it a couple frames earlier and then also reduce the amount that he's rotated back. He's not running to a stop, he's walking to a stop, so it's not like he really needs to like lean back. That might have been just a little bit too exaggerated through there. So I might again dial that back even more. So something like that. So already you can see we're able to get a pretty decent transition animation without much work. Then I'd probably just add another animation layer. And on this layer, again, I'm still just on the root and I'm focusing on a little bit more twist like this. So maybe as it steps forward here, maybe the body twists a bit more like that and just getting a bit more movement in here. And then through here, maybe the body twists like this, maybe leans that way a bit and then settles back to its 0 position at 28. Something like that. That's too much swaying back and forth. So I'm going to fix this. Like this can be straighter. And sometimes if I don't like things, I'll hide that layer, working non-destructively, which is great. Something else that I would definitely do in here, I'll select all of my arm controls, including my shoulder, add all those to an animation layer. Then I'm going to start in here and play around with getting a bit of drag in the arm as it comes to a stop. Swings forward further than it does here. Zero this out. Probably bring the arm forward. Basically just creating a bit more kind of overlap on the arm. And then it can kind of swing back. And then maybe go beyond that just a bit. So it goes back and then kind of settles forward. Kind of subtle movement there. And something else that I might do, again, kind of just showing the process, I'll add another animation layer on the root. And then maybe here, I'll play around with the up and down on the hips. So maybe here, I'll bring the hips just a little bit lower as he comes to a stop. Here at 8, I might actually bring the hips down. So the hips drop and then goes back up at 28. And this drop might be a little bit too much. Yeah, I think that's probably too much. Not sure if I really like that motion that I'm creating. Something that I could do is maybe bring this back a little bit. Add a few frames to it so it goes back and then kind of settles moving forward. Something like that might be a bit better. Still generally too much movement. What I can do now is open up my graph editor and play around with like the translate Y on this, maybe bring all this up so he's not dropping down quite as far. Bring that translate X back. Keeping that same forward back movement, but just reducing it a bit. You can see this is really the process I would take. I would go through here and start fine-tuning the different controls to add more detail to this. So actually working on the left arm, increasing the sway, working on the chest and the head to add a bit more overlap and, stopping to this animation. Obviously, as soon as we start just tweaking this as well, we can get even more detail in there. Just kind of playing around with some of this movement here. Maybe the chest is opened up more through here, rotates this way maybe, settles back down, and getting like a little bit more looseness in the chest. But yeah, hopefully this is helpful for you. These are animations, especially in working in games, you'll be working on these type of animations pretty often, these transition animations. The exact same technique I would use if I was going from an idle animation into a run cycle or the walk cycle. I would use the override layer to blend between those two animations and then just start fine tuning that with animation layers that I can start adding on and just adding more detail to that movement to get something that works a bit better. But you can see by using these animation layers, using an override layer, you're able to get the hard part done, which is just figuring out the feet placement as it's actually blending between two different animations. So blending, in this case, from a walk cycle into an idle animation. By using the blending motion of your override layer, you're able to get a lot of that information for free and then just refine that as needed. So there's definitely more to tweak on this. I would probably definitely spend more time fine tuning the stop. I still think it's probably stopping too quickly and too abruptly. So I'd probably add some frames in here, maybe keep the hips moving a little bit more forward and just adding more time for this stop and settle just to make sure I'm getting the correct feeling in here. But obviously it also really comes down to gameplay. How quick does this need to be? Does it really just need to stop abruptly and immediately as quick as you can? Then maybe this timing might work fine. And maybe I would actually need to speed up the stop as well. It kind of just all depends on sort of gameplay purposes. So if you found this video helpful, be sure to like and subscribe for more future content like this.